Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores our human condition. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We talk with researchers and other interesting people to unlock the mysteries of our behavior by using a behavioral science lens. And we do this in order to help you find your groove.
When we think about finding our groove, there are many elements that come into play. One of the areas we think is important to finding your groove is successfully dealing with those inevitable, stressful situations that life throws at us. Stressful situations are going to happen. So what can we do to cope and handle them effectively?
Yeah, or think of it this way. If you're in your groove, you'll be able to deal with stressful situations better. You probably won't get as rattled. You'll probably have more mental capacity and be more creative, and that would lead to better decisions too. All of that creates a happier and more productive life.
Currently, a lot of people turn to mindfulness, which is a type of meditation where you focus your awareness on what you're thinking and feeling in the moment. And you do that without judging those thoughts or feelings. But the challenge is this. When you're in a stressful situation, it's difficult to connect with what you're sensing because your brain goes into lockdown mode.
So how can we be more successful at staying in our groove when stressful situations come to call on us?
Here on Behavioral Grooves, we have conversations with researchers of all kinds. And today we're talking with a couple of psychologists who study how we handle stress by looking at how our brain reacts in brain scanners. You know, fMRI machines.
I got one in my closet, actually. Yeah.
I've used it a couple of times. Yeah. Maybe that's not an fMRI machine. Maybe it was something else I used in your closet. I don't know.
Norman Farb is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And Zindel Segal is a distinguished professor of psychology and mood disorders, also at the University of Toronto. However, both of them are studying psychology from the inside out. They may be psychologists, but they care a lot about how the brain functions on a neurological level.
We wanted to talk with them about their new book, Better in Every Sense, because it offers accessible and practical mental techniques to overcome even the most challenging mental dead ends. They remind us that access for getting in touch with our senses are, quite literally, at our fingertips.
We asked them about the path that led them to study how our senses, the basic five of taste, touch, sound, sight, and smell, can help us live happier and more productive lives.
Yeah, I think we came in with a sort of a caricature of what we thought mindfulness was doing, which was sort of deconstructing the self, say like the no self, and the enlightened person has no sense of self. But the problem wasn't that there was a conceptual self. It was that it was operating exclusively, right? It was like, I already know who I am and what I need to do in the world. And I don't need any other, hints from the audience. and so the more people are pushing out new information coming in, the more calcified that sense of self becomes. And we have more and more research over the past now, like coming up on 2 decades, that this is profoundly maladaptive. It's not that we have a sense of a self. It's when our self excludes any modification or change through the senses. So we saw this at a neural level, and it changed how we thought about all of this contemplative theory.
What Norm is getting at here is really important, a thing that he and Zindel discovered by looking at MRIs and brain scans. They realized that a key way humans actually maximize their experience in the world is by connecting through their senses, i.e. touch, smell, sight, sound, etc., not turning them off or tuning them out.
Yeah, in our conversation, you'll hear us talk about a couple of really cool concepts. The first one is sense foraging, and it's exactly what you'd think it is from the description. Going out and gathering up sensory information using our senses of taste, touch, sound, sight, and smell.
The second cool concept we talk about is called the house of habit, and how wonderful it can be as a way to help us get through the ever crazy busy day that we have, but also how it can limit the richness of the experiences that we have in the world.
It's a remarkable story, a really good book, and an amazing conversation with 2 truly fascinating researchers. So we hope that you sit back and relax with a very generous pour of sense foraging and enjoy our conversation with Norman Farb and Zindel Segal. Norman Zindel, Welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Hey, thank you for having us.
It is our pleasure. And I'm going to start with the speed round with Norm. I'd like to know, Norm, would you prefer to have dinner with your favorite musician or favorite athlete?
Probably favorite musician, just because I think there might be more of like a vocabulary for describing like the creative process. And I listen to a lot of spoken word stuff like hip hop. So I'd love to just kind of hear more of that. I know from experience also what it's like to grind things out as an athlete, but just like take the pain or something like that. I feel like we sort of run out of things to talk about if we weren't actually doing something.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Zindel, are you a coffee drinker or a tea drinker?
I'm a coffee virgin, but when I'm in Europe, I rely on coffee to help me stay awake and deal with jet lag.
Tell us, what is a coffee virgin?
I can wake up in the morning without having to have coffee.
Yeah.
And it rule me for the rest of the day.
Oh, yeah. I know some people like that, but that jet lag it helps with, so you're all set there?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, Norm, back to you. Is it likely that all of us are just going to get stuck at some point in our lives?
Yeah, most of us are probably stuck in some part of our lives right now. The part of being stuck isn't realizing you're stuck. So just like,
okay, there's more to talk about there.
Yeah,
for sure.
We will come back to that, definitely.
Yes. I'm going to throw this open for both of you. And I'm pretty sure I already know the answer to this, but that's, I'm like a lawyer in that way. Here we go. So is our brain stuck in the default mode network, or can we break free of this kind of stuck in DMN, excuse me?
Feels like the DMV sometimes. Oh, it's a matter of degree. Anytime you pay attention and sort of snap out of your reverie and are engaged in what's going on, you're probably shutting off the DMN, the default mode network, to an extent, and engaging other parts of your brain. But will we ever fully escape like meaning making and needing narratives and knowing what's going on? Hopefully not. In rare clinical cases where that happens, it's profoundly disabling. So yeah, I would say that you can get away from home, the house of habit as we call, but you end up coming back home.
All right.
Okay, and we're gonna come back to that as well. Zindel, would you like to add to that?
No, I think that's a good way of explaining the difference between escape and toggling, to have the ability to move in and out of DMN when we need it, but also stepping out of it when we want a bit more choice.
You guys have just like scattered all these wonderful nuggets that we're gonna come back to, all these words. So I just want to let listeners know that we're not going to pass up any of those. But Zindel, I'd like to start with you. Can you just first tell us about the title? Tell our listeners about what or how the science of sensation can actually help us reclaim our life.
Thanks. It's a title that I think tries to convey two things. One of them is the possibility of flourishing by leveraging some of the insights in new research on sensation, particularly the relationship between sensation and stress, and a good brain story around how stress robs us of sensation and privileges narrative and problem solving and self-referential kind of thought processes that can sometimes lead us to rely on habits and old worn routines time and again to help us. The ability to shift our attention and to make room for sensation allows new information to come in and takes some of the preference for the old narratives and replaces them with a way of viewing our circumstances through a bit of a wider lens, gives us a little bit more choicefulness and different ways of coping.
And so sensation, you're just focusing on touch here, or all the senses?
All the senses, because part of what we're trying to convey to people is there's so much available right at our fingertips through all of the senses, but we usually have a narrower channel when it comes to thinking of sensation. It might be taste, it might be touch, but other senses are equally available. They're just somehow, put it somewhat into our rearview mirror.
So you talk about it expanding kind of that perspective. What does that do for us? So if somebody is in a very stressful and anxious kind of place, what does that actually accomplish for them? And either of you can take that answer there.
What does it accomplish for them, to block out sensation or to sort of try to get back to it?
To bring back into it, right? Is kind of that explanation kind of brought in. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the core, if you really break it down to what sensation means, it means you're taking information in from the world, right? Including the world of your own body. Then we have this sort of, I would say, a conceit in the West that we actually think our ways into new ideas, right? That you're just going to think the right string of sentences together, and then all of a sudden, bam, you have a new idea. But really, novelty comes from the world and it changes us. And so when we get stressed, what we're trying to do is, we already feel under threat. So we don't want to let this self change. We don't want it to be changed, especially if that change could be catastrophic or destructive. So what intentionally moving into the sensation is doing is opening yourself up to be changed again, right? Which is scary. Yeah,
it is. And to follow up on that, Norm, do you think that we tend to undervalue the impact that the environment is having on our lives?
I think when people are stressed, especially if they have an interpersonal conflict at work or something really scary happens, you almost get hit by a car or something like that. We understand that the environment is having an impact on us, but I think we don't understand so much that our general sense of well-being is really powerfully determined by how we're relating to our environment. And the most primary environment is the environment of the felt sense of the body, but then the body's constantly responding to what it's taking in from the world outside of it. So I think we sort of see ourselves in some ways as these kind of brains in vats that occasionally like pop our ways outside, but we're completely immersed in the world to take on a sort of phenomenological approach, right? And undervaluing that is part of why people get stuck. They're like, oh, I protected myself from all of the world, so how come now nothing can change for me? Why do I always feel the same way?
Yeah. Zindel, anything to add to that?
No.
I like that. So we brought you guys mentioned this word earlier, right? And so you talk about the house of habit in the book. Can you explain that a little bit and help us understand what you mean when you talk about house of habit?
The house of habit essentially refers to living on automatic pilot and the benefits that come from doing that, and the efficiencies in the brain that come from doing that, and the ways in which we can engage in all kinds of really wonderful activities, problem solve, fix, analyze, and leverage the ability for certain routine behaviors, once they're frequently rehearsed, to be performed automatically without requiring many resources. But some of that breaks down when it comes to situations that involve emotion regulation, where situations demand a different kind of response, one perhaps where complexities require novelty, where novelty needs to be tolerated without an answer necessarily forthcoming. And so the house of habit ends up relying on the same solutions time and again because they have a way of being protective and possibly even marginally effective. But over time, they can also leave people stuck with a limited repertoire. And as we know, life sometimes presents circumstances to us that can be very challenging and demanding, either for ourselves, for the people that we're close to, or even for situations that we hear about remotely through news and other events in the world. And so our repertoire, if it's limited, I think works to our disadvantage. And so we stay in the house of habit because it's been effective, but we also limit ourselves by staying there. And part of what the book tries to talk about is both valuing the house of habit, but also recognizing that there are ways that we can venture out when we need to and access resources we may not even have considered prior.
Yeah. So you bring up this concept that the house of habit isn't bad in itself, right? It actually is very beneficial in many ways. It just doesn't always work in the most appropriate way given the different situations. Is there a way that we can understand when that house of habit may not be best suited to kind of deal with the world that or the situation that we're in? Is there anything that we can do for ourselves to make sure that we understand when maybe we are falling back into that house of habit, when we may need to be doing other things?
I think that there are subtle and not so subtle indicators. I think the not so subtle indicators are burnout, symptoms, dysregulation in our lives, in our physiology. And then there are more subtle symptoms or subtle signs related to a kind of chronic dissatisfaction, a lack of meaning. And I think where we see the house of habit operating is that it provides us with the same solutions to those problems, which is try harder, tough it out, gut it out, keep going. And what happens over time is that just contributes to the wear and tear on the body, the wear and tear on the person. And because we're not really accessing new information that can provide us with a different way of addressing these scenarios. So that to me is usually a tip off that the best information or advice we can give ourselves is to tough it out and keep going, because the house of habit really has a very marked discrepancy reduction mission. It's like you're here and you want to get there. You just have to keep figuring out how do you get there, versus taking a wider view on things and maybe seeing if there's other pathways that are more advantageous.
Zen, I love that you brought up this idea that there are sort of more both this category of very obvious issues, but also some very nuanced issues. And I think that it's easier to just blaze over those. Norm, I want to ask you, what is the key to helping us understand and identify what some of these more nuanced house of habit downsides might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, the things that we've automated, the deep habits in our lives are serving us good enough, right? And I think that's a bit insidious about it.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's probably not that great an idea to wait for like a catastrophe to happen, a total breakdown, before we start to become a little bit reflective. And at the same time, like, who's got time to reflect, right? Like, I'll reflect later when like all my stuff is done. And that's sort of like, I've got to get through all of my habits. When all my habits are done, then I'll have a moment of like conscious self-reflection. And I think the key is to realize that in the same way that we've learned that we need to invest time in our physical health and in our nutrition, in reaching out to others so friendships don't break down. Like, we know in these specific domains of our lives that we have to be proactive. I just don't think that we think about the calcification of our own mental routines in the same way that we might think of, like, you know, your artery starting to calcify because you've just been like clenching and eating high cholesterol foods, you know, for years on end. So I don't know if there's going to be like one canary in the coal mine. It is this sort of creeping sense of getting worn down, of, you know, everything's the same, of like things used to be different, things used to change for me, but now I'm just sort of like waiting it out. So this sort of dread, ennui, like that, it seems to be a malaise in the modern age, but has been written about historically. And if you feel like that's starting to creep up in life, there is a solution, which is to actually take a pause and start to check in, right? Like with what you're actually feeling, what you are ignoring habitually. But I think the whole reason we wrote this book, as opposed to just like refining habits, how to build better habits, because there's a lot of scholarship that's really great around that already, is because part of the nature of being caught in this house of habit is that you feel as though you're doing everything that you should be, right? Right. And so it's when that is still meeting up with some kind of meta discrepancy. Like, I'm doing everything that I was supposed to be doing. I'm doing it as well as I can. And it just doesn't seem like it's good enough. Like, I'm kind of not making it where I need to be in life. That kind of deep-seated thing, which is like really scary, like an existential kind of dread.
Yeah.
Like, what if this isn't good enough? That's the sign that maybe you need to take a break from the routine.
It's interesting. And I love the analogy that you used of the you know, your physical health and the calcification of your arteries, right? Because you kind of say that, right? You don't necessarily feel that calcification of your arteries until it gets to a certain point where then it does, right? It's like
my left arm is tingling.
Yeah, right. And it seems like it's very similar in this, is you can just keep going. I can try harder. I can do stuff until it hits that point where, as you said, that existential kind element comes out, and then it's wow, that it hits you in the face. And so I think that's big. I do want to get into, because you guys start talking about sense foraging in the book, and I think that's part of as you kind of move past, you know, all right, here's the house of habit, and now we can solve some of this. But before we get there, I do want to have you guys just comment on active inference and perceptual inference, because for me, I found it really fascinating. I actually used it with a client this past week in kind of looking at their work and saying, you need to be doing more perceptual inference in this and sitting in this and trying to anyway. So I don't want to try to explain it. I'll let the experts explain it. So if you guys could talk a little bit about that, and then maybe lend that into sense foraging?
Yeah. Well, I would say that this predictive coding model of the brain is so hot right now, to quote Zoolander, and it's this like it's this idea that our brains are, as Zindel already mentioned, these discrepancy reducing machines. So our brains hate surprise. Surprise is really metabolically expensive, and from the time you're a very young child till you die, you're just trying to not be surprised. Most of what your formal education, unless you're an artist, perhaps, is training you to do is to reduce to surprise and get things right. And so when we're surprised, so the theory goes, the primary source of all human motivation, right? Mm-hmm. You thought things were going to be one way, and then whoa, something shows up a different way. And there's two ways to reduce surprise. One is to assume your model of the world as it ought to be is actually pretty good, and some aberration has creeped up that you now need to act upon the world. You need to have agency and act upon the world to reduce. So an example would be like, my stomach is making weird sounds and giving me these pangs, and my stomach ought not to feel that way. My model of how my stomach normally feels is the right model. So I'm going to take an antacid, and if it prolongs, I'll go see a doctor, I'll seek help. And what my goal here is actually to make my stomach feel the way it ought to feel. The world should match my model. That's active inference. And by far, this is what most people, I use this as a little supplementary question when I teach normal psychology and ask people, which do you do most? And almost everyone says, yep, that's what I do. That's what like educated, skilled people do. Perceptual inference is kind of like bringing in a little of that Eastern stuff. And, to be transparent, we both have done a lot of work in mindfulness and meditation traditions, where there are some types of problems where it is actually your model that's the problem, right? Like, why is everyone I meet an asshole? Can I turn on this podcast?
You feel free. Yeah. Yes.
So if you meet one person. You meet one person and they're an asshole. Yeah, maybe it's them, right? Maybe that's not someone to deal with. If everyone you meet is an asshole, there's something about how you relate to other people that's the problem, right? And we walk around a lot of times, especially with our feelings, assuming there's something wrong with the feeling. We ought not to feel this way. We shouldn't have these reactions from other people in this way. We want to fix them. We want to fix the feelings. And this is where perceptual inference, which is the kind of gut check time, we're like, maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe I should let what the feedback from the world change my expectations for the world. A bit more of a serious example of this is people who suffer from chronic pain conditions. We're biologically driven to avoid pain. Like, that's the point of pain, is to provoke an avoidance behavior. But in chronic pain conditions, you can't get away from the pain, by definition. So if you continue to use active inference in the face of chronic pain, what you'll end up doing, it often is going to more and more extreme lengths, taking more and more painkillers, experimental therapies, things like this, and your life cannot begin again until the pain is gone. But in these conditions, what's very powerful is to actually renegotiate this idea that, like, if I'm the kind of person who's in pain sometimes, maybe that's okay. Maybe my model is the kind of person who has pain. And then once you have that model of yourself as someone who's sometimes in pain, you realize it's not all the time. And also it doesn't determine every other aspect of your life, because you're no longer constantly having this violation of there's something wrong with me, right? Like, I mean, in some sense, in a medical sense, maybe you're not the perfect human who's pain-free, but at a personal sense, you're like, yeah, it's there. And so, like, what are we having for lunch? And so that's a big updating, right? It's not trivial to do that. It's not as simple as popping an acid. And part of, to bring things full circle while we talk about sense foraging, is because there really is a perennial wisdom about how one can engage in perceptual inference that is not part of the common Western curriculum.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So let's keep this going. Zindel, help us with a definition. Help us understand what is sense foraging, and then let's talk about some of the applications.
So sense foraging is a intentional effort to connect with sensation in the present moment by shifting attention to a particular activity that might be sensory rich, that allows contact and exploration.
And so how does that help us in leading a better life?
Well, I mean, that's like a huge trajectory.
But just simplify, just a couple sentences to answer that.
Sentences.
You can do it, right? There you go.
Well, you wrote a book on it, so you should be able to answer the question, right? I mean, it goes back to what Norm was saying. Sense foraging is really the art of trying to puncture and allow models to be updated. Mm-hmm. And so sense foraging allows people to approach activities or experiences that they've already coded as knowing what it will give them. but through curiosity and through a kind of sensory exploration, may find out that there's a lot more in these things that they anticipated. Those moments of surprise, those moments of, wow, I never thought that that was there, or I've been taking this walk for years, but never noticed that there are 5 colors of bark on a tree. That's this small opening to suggest that maybe my models aren't absolutist, but they could benefit from revision. And I think that the accumulation of these moments, and sense foraging is a way of starting that process in a very non threatening manner. Go for a walk, go for a swim, open an orange and eat it and smell it. Those are very non threatening ways of trying to suggest that the mind isn't fully capable of predicting everything in your experience, and even experience itself being able to deliver moments of surprise that can start that process of lubricating models so that they can be more amenable to change.
As cognitive misers, though, isn't it just easier for us to be absolutist, to be in the house of habit and just go, it's just the same old thing? And I'm just, I'm eating an orange. It's fine. Blah, blah, blah. How can we unshake that? How can we unstuck that? How can we help our listeners sort of say, well, I take the walk every day. Just because I haven't noticed all 5 colors of bark, I'm still living a good life.
Yeah, and they might. And I hope they are. I think the idea that we've been doing this all the time in itself leaves open the possibility that it has become a habit. But that there is often way more in terms of vitality. And one of the things that we do in our book is to try to get people to notice how things change and shift and move, even in small micro moments of engagement with some of our senses. And we don't really encode that when we do things like go for walks or eat food or listen to music or things like that. So these are moments of opening. Now, I think your question is a deeper one too, in the sense of why do people try to stop smoking or reduce their alcohol intake or go to therapy? They need to be pushed by a certain measure of suffering in their lives, feeling like they want to either address something or the possibility of achieving a little bit more flourishing. Like you said, they might be living comfortable lives, but maybe there's something missing in terms of maybe wanting to do something for other people or wanting to make a contribution of some sort. So they're comfortable, but maybe they want to get a little bit uncomfortable. And so I think the sense foraging agenda is a small way of starting to do that without needing a lot of suffering, although sometimes it can also be a way of people starting if they are at a place where they're struggling.
I like that. And it's an interesting piece when we think about this as it can be a practice, right? That we can start to do, that is, again, going back to, well, if we have a health practice to make sure that we are healthy individuals from a physical perspective, this is a part of that practice that can help us become more mentally healthy in the long run, so we can deal with that. Would that be, am I overstepping the boundary there when I say that?
No, I think the term practice is very much centered on where we come from as well in some of our own research. We come from using and examining and evaluating mindfulness, both in terms of its neural effects and its clinical effects. Mindfulness is a practice that needs to be rehearsed and repeated in order for you to get its benefits. But many people shy away from committing to a mindfulness practice. And we feel that many of the benefits of a mindfulness practice are available in these micro moment access points that sense foraging can deliver to people. So you don't have to sign up for the full measure, but you can still get the sensory saturated experience that comes from meditation practice or other contemplative practices by engaging in sense foraging.
Yeah. Norm, the term toggling has come up a couple of times. Can you help us get a better understanding of what you mean in the book by toggling, and why is that important?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It gets back even to your point about us being cognitive misers, that it's really expensive, both in a metabolic sense and it's just like so much effort, right? To be engaged and present all the time. And like, sometimes I just want to zone out. And there's really good research to show that even though people know about all these highfalutin forms of emotion regulation and like, I should go to the meaning and change the meaning. And then when I see things from a more enlightened view, I'll be happy. When people are really stressed, they just need distraction, right? They just need to relax. And so toggling is to sort of balance this idea that they're sort of put some guardrails on this idea that although we're pushing people to find an access point to where they do this sort of energy intensive sensory exploration and try on, valuing surprise and valuing the emotional turmoil and chaos that can be very fruitful that comes from that. We need to balance that against also taking care of ourselves and getting the laundry done and, not relearning every skill at every moment, which would be disastrous. And so toggling is bringing a little bit of intentionality as to like pick your battles, right? So you're feeling really like this one area of your life, you're beating your head against the wall, you're doing the same thing every time and getting the same result and it's not satisfactory. Like this may be a place to bring a little bit of this kind of foraging intention to it. And then there's other times when like your habit's working great, like your golf drive is working perfectly. You haven't crashed your car for a while. You're getting along well with your kids, whatever it is. Like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right? So it's sort of giving a person a final sort of nudge, because we did a couple different nudges in the book to recognize habit and then do sense foraging. And the kind of final nudge I think is like, okay, now like figure out where you might want to apply this. This isn't about like walking away from everything you've known before, but actually realizing that these brain networks that are competing, the default mode network, which is driving habit, the salience network, which is alerting you to something where you need to actually be engaged in the moment, they're both part of you. It's really about skillfully deploying the tools you have to figure out where it's a time to grow and explore and where there's a time to kind of consolidate and exploit what you already know. This explore-exploit distinction is fundamental to a lot of different academic theory around living organisms.
Yeah. You give an example in the book about spilling wine, the Cabernet Sauvignon, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to use that or help or tell our listeners about that example and what you were trying to get there?
The example was an effort to show how House of Habit very quickly takes us into a narrative description of costs, consequences, and catastrophes. And so this is an example of a dinner for a sales manager who'd just been promoted, and you're at the dinner and you're at a table with a whole bunch of other folks, and you lean over and spill a glass of wine, and you can see the rivulets of red wine running towards the sales manager's dress. And in that moment, you can start to see everything as a catastrophe and feel ashamed, embarrassed, and as would be a very natural reaction. And you kind of freeze or get up quickly. And then we were saying that all of that is a very natural way of reacting, but there's also a lens through which watching it from a sensory filter can allow us to see all these things going on from just a little bit of distance. And instead of getting caught up in some of the narratives about what this means about you, what this says about you, what this says about you as a worker, as a person, there may be a way in which you can notice that, put it aside, jump into action, throw a serviette on the table to try to catch some of the red wine, and then offer in a very gracious way to pay for whatever dry cleaning bill the person might have. And it's not like we're getting away from the event. It's just that we're trying to put some things aside because our sensory focus sometimes may allow a larger view of what's going on to open up for us versus being caught in this, feeling exposed and ashamed and the whole loop and all of that. That's sort of, I think, how that vignette plays out.
Yeah.
It's a great story. I'm curious, and I'd love it if both of you would actually answer this individually. We'll start with Norm, but the book is built on piles of research that you two have spent many years of your professional careers working on, and I'm kind of curious about what is it that got you started. What was the hypothesis, and what was the catalyst that said, "Oh, this thing about mindfulness, this is really interesting." What, Norm? Would you be so kind as to start that?
Yeah, I think we came in with a sort of a caricature of what we thought mindfulness was doing, which was sort of deconstructing the self. Sort of like the no self, and the enlightened person has no sense of self. And this was fueled by decades of research, first with memory research and what's called the levels of processing theory, and then neuroimaging research showing that we really knew what part of the brain cared about things that were self-relevant. So we had this idea that if people were benefiting from mindfulness, and Zindel and many other people really paved the ground to show that kind of clinical work, that there's already efficacy to these practices, then maybe the reason why people were benefiting from doing contemplative practices was they were learning to just break away from this default network. The self-relevance kind of region, the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortices are hubs of the default mode network. So we went in thinking that we were going to find like the brain pictures that showed the dissolution of the self.
Yeah.
And we spent a long time kind of even reanalyzing data sets, being like, why isn't this the story? Because it's such a good story, right? Like everyone thinks I'm going to get rid of myself, I'll be happy. And what we found instead was that there was a second pattern happening when people were exposed to, emotional challenges or self-referential stimuli in the MRI, which was that when there were stressful stimuli, the sensory parts of the brain, especially the sense of the body's internal state, a part of the brain called the insula, the island that connects the more primitive limbic system to the cerebral cortex and is supposed to map out what's happening inside our bodies in the moment, and other sensory regions were being deactivated even as people got self-referential. And if you looked at those two patterns, self-referential activity in the default mode network and the sensory region such as the insula deactivating, what was actually predicting whether someone had depression symptoms or was more likely to relapse in depression if they had a history of depression was a deactivation of the sensory regions.
Wow.
And so it wasn't really what we thought. And it was in an indirect way, having a really strong sense of self and really focusing on conceptual knowledge about the self was starving resources from sensation. But the problem wasn't that there was a conceptual self. It was that it was operating exclusively, right? It was like, I already know who I am and what I need to do in the world. And I don't need any other, hints from the audience. And so the more people are pushing out new information coming in, the more calcified that sense of self becomes. And we have more and more research over the past now, like coming up on 2 decades, that this is profoundly maladaptive. It's not that we have a sense of a self. It's when our self excludes any modification or change through the senses. So we saw this at a neural level, and it changed how we thought about all of this contemplative theory.
Yeah.
Zindel, would you like to add to that?
For me, there were a couple of things that propelled me to really believe in this book. One of them had to do with a certain despair that I felt, and one of them had to do with a chance to work with Norm to write a book together. That was the pleasure part. I've been funded by NIMH to study mindfulness, to evaluate mindfulness against antidepressant medication for treatments of depression. And a lot of the work that we did, including offering mindfulness programs digitally and publishing in top-tier journals, were cookie cutter good things that academics are expected to do. And I did them. And it did not move the needle one bit.
Yeah.
In terms of providing access for people who live outside of New York City or Toronto or a large metropolitan center to these resources. And so I became much more convinced that a popular book focusing on this hypothesis that Norm just described, which was training in interoceptive awareness, training in sense foraging, is a lower and common denominator that is one of the deliverables from many contemplative practices. But how can we help people access these deliverables without necessarily committing to contemplative practice? And so sense foraging in a way, and the meditation teachers who might be listening to this, maybe rolling their eyes positively. I do feel anyways that there is a way in which this can help people access it very widely and broadly, and then see for themselves whether they want to go further or what this can do for them in response to some of my earlier experience from this kind of academic success, but very little in the sense of scale or reach.
Yeah, it's always interesting. We talk we talk almost exclusively with researchers, and you can publish the greatest work of insight in science and it gets published in an academic journal and it has a very limited, mostly, people who read it. It's inside baseball for people who like inside baseball.
Right.
So I love this concept that you bringing this to a broader audience. And with that, one of the things that I really enjoyed, and I think Tim did as well, about the book is at the end of each chapter, you had these exercises. You had these, again, maybe if they're the micro pieces that you were talking about, those elements to kind of help people, practice this, to get into it. And this may be like, asking you to, pick a favorite child or to do something like that. But we don't have time to go over all of them in this podcast. But if you had to pick one or two that you could share with our listeners that might be just something so they go, oh, yeah, I can try that. What would those one or two practices be? And I'll leave it up to you guys. Who wants to start?
I can start.
Okay.
So once again, this gets back to this notion of I know what this song sounds like, or I know what this picture looks like, and I know what this food tastes like. And so what we encourage people to do is to pick something that they know, and then to watch different senses register and notice intensities that kind of arrive in the mind, that register, that pass away, and maybe other intensities that come next in a sequence, or maybe there's not very much, or maybe everything gets sort of mixed together. And what we're trying to suggest to people is that a sensation, an experience of the senses, isn't something that is like an on-off. It's actually got a movement to it. It's got a movement through time. It's got a fluctuation and a flux to it that we can start to recognize, which can be really surprising because, cream cheese is cream cheese. But when you actually start to see what are the sequence and order of sensations, cold from the fridge, smooth, chewy or gummy or saliva, you're seeing different elements and you're kind of parcellating moments that you're actually paying attention, as Norm mentioned, in very intensive ways. But the experience changes, and then that takes that whole category, well, I know what cream cheese is, into something a little bit different. And that's really a moment of sensory foraging, sensory engagement.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I love just the concept of cream cheese, because you go, well, that's so fast. I mean, I eat that down. So
right?
but it does. When you said that, I'm going, oh, I never actually thought of, I'm going to go downstairs and try some cream cheese on a bagel or something. Norm, how about you?
I really like this practice that I do myself as well, where I go somewhere where I am often getting into stress, like my work desk or something like that. And first, I actually we recommend you can practice spinning all that up, like really, like it's not all about just get out of the default network, like get it going. So like you're sitting there, think about all the stuff you have to do for but give yourself like a time limit. Don't be too cruel. Give yourself like 30 seconds, spin it all up as much as you can, and then just check in, like, how much do you care about what's going on around you in the room? And most people are like, not at all, because I have so much to do right now. So you just kind of injected like a bit of the venom, right? And it's like, now take 30 seconds. I want you to name 5 things around the room that you don't care about at all, that you just normally don't even look at or pay attention to. And be like, okay, yeah, like a wall, or like there's a picture frame or something like that. And so it's not some kind of mystical exercise. Mm-hmm. And so you do that for 30 seconds and you really just keep really focused. Doesn't have to be eyes closed, deep breathing, anything like that. Just start naming stuff around the room. And then at the end of that time, check back in, like, how do you feel now? And what we're trying to sort of lay the sort of path for is realizing, like, there is something that it's like when your mind's going crazy and you just lumping tasks upon task on yourself, and something it feels like, and you can learn what it feels like when you just don't care about anything around you because of that.
Yeah.
And then you can do something that seems really basic and dumb, like I'm going to just label items as though like I'm a 2-year-old like learning basic language. And at the end of that time, you've actually redistributed those mental resources. And so, nothing's 100%, but a lot of times people are like, wow, I actually felt like I was able to put down a lot of the stuff, which by definition was my list of stuff I'm not allowed to put down. Yeah. So, that's about just giving people really concrete access points as opposed to some really like rarefied mystical experience. And if that's a hook and someone wants to go further down, and we talk about a bunch of different access points in the book, and become like an expert in any one of those kind of traditions, not all of them are meditation traditions, then more power to them. But if it doesn't show up right away, like then the book doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And her book is all about making sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I loved I along those access points. I love the discussion about Jimi Hendrix and listening versus hearing Jimi Hendrix. I have to just kind of be curious. Did one of you like spring that up because there's like this great musical thing? But we should actually talk about. So what's the difference between hearing and listening? And is it material? And should we pay attention to it? Zindel, you've got a thought about that?
I mean, I'm sure there are musicologists who have like much more refined answers to this, but hearing, I think, involves partly a sonic event and partly a cognitive event. Categorization, familiarity, and putting something that you're hearing into a category. I think listening could be akin to more of what I was describing with the cream cheese, where it's possible that you're in a receptive mode, receiving information as it's arriving at your ear, and maybe looking at the qualities of that information in terms of whether it's loud or soft, subtle, obvious, consistent, or interrupted. And so listening allows you to look at almost like the sonic profile of auditory stimulation, and you're receptive to it. I think hearing could be something where you're already categorizing it. You're not receiving as much as you are working with it in order to place it in something that's already known.
That actual quote, though, came from a movie that's been remade, but it was from White Men Can't Jump, where Woody Harrelson is getting like sort of criticized for playing Jimi Hendrix in the car by
Wesley Snipes.
By Wesley Snipes, because he's saying like you don't have the culture like in order to really appreciate. Like the sound is hitting your ears, but you just can't really hear it in the deep way that I can hear it. So I think in that situation, like hearing is supposed to be like that's something deeper and more meaningful to actually it can show up. But I think Zindel's completely right that like if you're just putting something on the radio and it's just like in the background, you're hearing it in a basic like physics level, but you're not really hearing it. Right?
Yeah.
And then you can get into all kinds of interesting debates around what kind of other preparation and cultural affordances you need to really hear a certain type of music. And I'm sure there's a lot of there's some hot button issues in there as well.
Yeah.
We'll get the musicologists on at some point to have that. I'm curious, and I'd like to hear both of your thoughts about this. But if we'll start with Norm on this. If you were stranded on a desert island for a year and you could only take 2 musical artists' catalogs with you, and take everything that they've ever created, but only 2 artists, which 2 artists would you take?
That's
and I wish our listeners could see that Zindel is like already
like freaking out. It's like only 2. One of the first sort of albums that really like made an impact on me was The Low End Theory by A Tribe Called Quest. So they're like a 1990s like sort of hip hop group. So I would definitely bring their stuff with me, and I can bring a second album.
Yes,
you can bring their whole catalog, their entire
catalog,
all that they have. You have like
all the cameos, all of that kind of stuff. And then I really like electronic stuff as well. So I think I would probably bring everything by Underworld. Yeah, so it's sort of deeper, rhythmic, like tribal, pulsing music, and that would give me a good counterpoint between the intellectual sort of verbal work and then just like primal bass line kind of stuff. And I think that would sort of keep me somewhat sane on that island for a while.
Is Underworld kind of a classic EDM? I'm not familiar with them.
Yeah, they actually just had something a bit more recent, a recent single come out, but they've been around also since like that was sort of my formative music years, like in the early 90s and mid 90s, and like sort of a bit of rave culture, but before everything got sort of candy caned and things like that. It's a bit darker, but their most famous song is Born Slippy, probably, which was in Trainspotting.
Okay, have to check that out.
All right.
Okay, Zindel.
So I'll tell you what I would take, and I'll tell you what I would leave. I would take every Rolling Stones album that had Mick Taylor on as the guitarist, and I would leave everything afterwards.
Wow.
Configuration of the Stones when Mick Taylor was in there. So definitely get your yayas out, the 1969 concert at Madison Square Gardens, for sure.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is I'd probably take Cream and Everything Eric Clapton ever did.
Okay.
So you'd be okay with Blind Faith and all the iterations.
Yeah. Layla, Derek and the Dominoes.
Derek and the Dominoes, yeah. Okay. But with the Stones, you get to just before, what was it, like Exiles on Main Street, and you're just done. No more Stones?
After Exile on Main Street, kind of. I mean, sort of before Ron Wood joined, because I think that was their best iteration of them. I mean, I know they did a lot of other stuff, but
I like that you can have more, and you're just like, I don't even want this.
That's what I was thinking too. I'm going, you can choose just not to listen to it, but no, I don't even want it on the island.
Yeah, leave it on the mainland.
Leave that behind. It's like I don't even want that.
That's almost like sensory deprivation.
Yeah, or some kind of asceticism, maybe.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, yeah. Fantastic.
But I was curious on the bio that Tim, you've got music featured pretty prominently. Are you involved? Are you in a band? Are you?
Yeah. Yes, I've played and recorded and performed for much of my life.
That's cool.
I have 6 CDs that I've created and produced. I'm working on 3 more right now, and so I stay active musically.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And both of you active musically? Do you write, record, play?
Zindel has a little side band going, right?
Play with friends in rehearsal studios and perform here and there, very rarely. Norm's got his own thing going.
Yeah?
Yeah, I do. Well, no, I do like a holiday mixtape once a year and just like beat match a bunch of stuff together.
Oh, fantastic.
Cool. Used to do more like performance, like hip hop or like emceeing at like to drum and bass and things like that, but that seems like it's fading into the rearview mirror now.
Well, I get the priorities change. I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, about a year and a half ago, and it's been hard, really, kind of getting back into the music scene. Starting a new job and a whole bunch of those kinds of things has been, very time consuming. But yeah, Kurt and I even recorded a few songs together. So,
oh really?
Yeah, Kurt's a songwriter too.
Yeah, not even close. But no, it's interesting. We name behavioral grooves, and we both came at it from two. Like we both liked the name, but we liked it for different reasons. And I came in with behavioral grooves, like grooves, in our brain, and we're habits and routines and different things.
Yeah,
and Tim's like, behavior and music, and it was like, and so. Very first interview we did, all of a sudden he starts asking musical questions at the end, and I'm like, what where did this come from? And anyway, it has been a great ad because it does. There's like a whole different world that kind of shifts, and so it's almost like a sensation, right? I mean, we're talking very deep, intellectual kind of things, and then we get to this whole other side of people, and it opens things up, and it's a really interesting way of exploring and talking with them, which I've would not have anticipated to if you would have asked me it before we started this. So
you have a built-in toggle already, right?
Yeah,
and
I mean that's
you're thinking about sound and emotion and like so. I mean, we're not inventing anything new. It's just creating a vocabulary for people to start thinking about, like, oh, am I doing this? Right?
Yeah.
And so
which we love. We are really, really glad that you have done all the research and that you've written the book. The two of you, we are really loving it. By the way, Zindel, Norm, thank you both for being guests on Behavioral Grooves today.
Our pleasure.
It is an awesome conversation. I had a ton of fun. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, lots of fun. Thank you both.
Thank you. Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Norm and Zindel, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our sensory-deprived brains.
Yeah.
You and I are definitely, we need to have more of this sense foraging in our lives because, man, we don't do enough of it, I think.
I'm hungry for more sense foraging.
You're
Definitely.
hungry. You're hungry. There you go. See? Taste. Oh, there you go. Oh, and the smell of that bacon or whatever it is. It's morning, so
Yeah.
the smell of my coffee, which would probably turn you off, but there you
No,
go.
I love the smell of coffee. I just don't like the taste of it. So how about that? There's a weird disconnect, isn't it? Like the smell, that sense is really enlivened by coffee, but the taste side of coffee is, just doesn't work for me. Yeah. Okay.
When was the last time you tasted coffee?
I don't know. It's probably 10 years old or something.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
See, I think
it could be different. Yeah, it could be.
You should your taste buds change every 7 years or so. Somebody told me one time, and I like that belief, so I'm going with it. I have no idea if it's true.
Okay, Dr. Science.
Hey, somebody said your tastes change and so that's like their thing was actually it was one of my employees, Alex, who was like going, I hate tomatoes, but I try them once every 7 years because taste buds change every 7 years, and so I might have changed.
How does she know that she's got like the right 7 years? Like, what if she's? I guess that it doesn't.
She marks it down on her calendar, and 7 years later, there you go. I'm March 31st. I'm going to taste another tomato in 2029 or whatever it was.
Time for a change.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Anyway, so all right, Mr. Houlihan, what do we want to take out of this conversation? Because there was a lot.
Oh, it was a great conversation. These guys are terrific. I really enjoy them as people, and I really appreciate them as researchers. Just really grateful. And maybe we should start with sort of the problems and the symptoms and sort of the downsides. Like, our world is complex. It's not getting less complex. It's getting more stressful and more chaotic.
What? It's not. It's simplifying. I mean, come on. That's what all of like social media and everything is, just simplifies my life.
Yeah, because there's only 140 characters in a tweet. Yeah.
Not anymore. That was way
ago.
aged, and it's not a tweet anymore. It's an X, isn't it? Whatever it is.
I don't know.
There you go. No, I agree. So to your point, right? The world is complex. We know from like surveys and other pieces that people are more stressed than ever, that the burnout and getting worn down has increased, the tendency for people to kind of have malaise and various different pieces. I think it's huge.
Yeah, they even mentioned, I think it was Norm that mentioned dysregulation, which people might not know that is a mental health symptom that makes it difficult to control your emotions and to act on them. And dysregulation is on the increase. Yeah. So this is a real problem. Dread, ennui. Like we've got a world that is more difficult to deal with than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, and so we can just figure it out later, right, Tim?
Oh, right. Exactly. When you come into that stressful situation, say, "Oh, I don't have to deal with that now." No, that's pretty crappy. It reminds me of David White, the poet. I probably talked to him about him before, but I remember a big fan of David White. He says that the world is too compassionate to stop and let us get off and fix our stuff and get back on. The world just keeps going, and that's actually a compassionate thing, as the way he states it. And I think what Norm and Zinn are referring to is like the better prepared you are for those situations, the better decisions you'll make, the happier you'll be in your life.
Right. And that we can't wait until all of our stuff is done.
Yeah,
and to then go back and figure it out and reflect that.
Right.
Part of what I found fascinating, particularly, so sense foraging, I think is just it's a fantastic term.
Yeah.
Because you sit there and you're thinking foraging. Well, all right, I'm searching through the forest for, I'm foraging for food and various different things.
Yeah.
But you're foraging through your senses. And I love this concept of being able to be in the moment. And I love the brain scan studies that says it's not about, kind of distracting yourself from the world. It's actually putting yourself more into the world that helps us deal with those stresses and those feelings of tension, and all of the other factors that are much more prevalent in our life these days.
Yeah, I think about recent layoffs at the bank that I was working at. There are a lot of people who, for the first time in their life, they were dealing with a reduction in workforce, and it was really stressful for them. And it just was. You can't not have it be stressful when it's the first time that it's happening to you. And a great way of dealing with that would be to get into all of my senses. Not just how am I feeling, but what's it actually like to actually have, to touch things around me, to be listening to things around me. How attuned am I to all the things that are going on, and prepare me for the next game? Because if you're 25, it's gonna happen again.
Yeah.
There's gonna be another layoff. It just will.
Yeah. Well, all right. So I'm going to quote Zinn. I think he said, "Sense foraging is really the art of trying to puncture and allow models to be updated." Fantastic, right? Fantastic. Yeah. And this idea, and again, I'm quoting him again, it says, "And so sense foraging allows people to approach activities or experiences that they've already coded as knowing what it will give them." This is what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
"But through curiosity and through a sense of sensory exploration, may find out that there's a lot more in these things than they anticipated."
Yeah.
So just let's unpack that for a bit. That there's a lot more in these things than they anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
This is that we've talked about this. This is having my eggs in the morning, and instead of just wolfing them down, is paying attention and stopping and savoring those eggs. And you know what? There's a lot more in that when I savor that, when I focus in and I forage on that sense of taste or that sense of smell of my coffee, that it takes on a new meaning and it updates that model of life. And therefore, I'm better prepared the next time something like that happens.
The next time you have eggs.
The next time I have
it's going to be enhanced and easier and hopefully more fulfilling. I think the keystone word in that sentence for me is curiosity. Like, you just have to be willing to be open to that what if.
Yeah.
Or compared to what?
Right. Compared to what? Right. The relative aspect. Yeah. Zinn gave the example of walking that walk, right? He took the walk for 5 years, but then, finally paid attention to that tree and the color of the bark on the tree. This is when we think about grooving, when we think about finding your groove, this book fits so well with this concept of what we think about is finding those groove moments, finding those tree barks that we haven't paid attention to, that when you stop and actually look at that, you not only are savoring it, you're not just foraging in that sense of sight, but you're almost experiencing this sense of awe, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That there is this overarching facet to our lives of saying, wow, the richness of a simple thing such as this tree really kind of helps us put everything else in perspective and gives us a sense of awe that permeates throughout our entire body. And again, do I have the research to back this up? Zinn and Norm might, but I don't. But there's the anecdotal component of that I think there's some truth to it.
So to what degree, Kurt, do you think that savoring contributes to finding your groove?
I think that it's a key part. I don't think it's the only part.
Definitely not. Yeah.
But there is an aspect. We've talked about the sunrises and sunsets. And again, we can go when we talk about House of Habit, right? This aspect. I think there's often too many times.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I think there is this aspect of staying on the foraging part, right? In the savoring part, a sunset or a sunrise, we can so quickly just pass that by.
Yeah.
the tree on our walk, the food on our table, the smell of coffee in the morning, right? So often we can just, you know, be so caught up in our routines and our habits that we don't take the time to savor that and to notice it and to have that fill our lives a little bit richer and to put us in that groove, that idea. We talked with Mike Norman, whose episode will come out shortly after this one, I believe, about rituals and the difference between rituals and habits and routines.
Yeah.
And part of that is the meaning that we ascribe. So instead of just doing a routine or an activity, right? Instead of just eating that breakfast, we put meaning on that breakfast. And by so doing, I think there's a sense, or there's a part of this that is this sense foraging, that we pay more attention to it, that there is a deeper richness to that aspect of my morning coffee ritual,
Mhm.
right? I don't just drink my
Oh,
coffee to
yeah.
drink my coffee. It's a ritual of how I prepare the coffee, of the smell that comes, and I appreciate it, and the warmth of the cup, and then the taste of that coffee as I drink it. You would maybe forget that last part, but all of the other things I think you could probably fall into. But there's an aspect of sense foraging, I think, with that comes in with these rituals and various different pieces. So
I want to go back to your statements about habits and kind of bridging into our discussion about the house of habit, this idea of life on autopilot. Imagine if you're the kind of person that is skipping through every sunset and every sunrise, that you're not smelling the toast in the toaster, that you're not enjoying the eggs. If those are your habits, imagine just changing your habits so that when the toast is in the toaster, you just lean over and give it a whiff and go, oh, that bread smells good as it's warming up. Or
yeah.
and just taking the moment to make it part of your habit, make it part of your new routine, to enjoy just a moment of the sunset, to go, the colors are amazing tonight. That's so cool. So we can use habits in a way that enhances our life, or habits can be really restrictive.
Well, to your point, you talked about life on autopilot, and sometimes habits put our life on autopilot. The classic example of a habit, right, or a routine is that drive into work, and how at the beginning you
Yes.
had to focus on where you're going to turn and different pieces, but after a while it becomes habit, and you don't even remember the journey home. You
Right.
don't remember turning off of Highway 100 onto Excelsior Boulevard and then going down Lake Street and turning left on 24th. You don't pay attention to it because you're on autopilot. And the fact of the matter is that we miss so much of life when that happens, right? This idea that this novelty and complexity that comes into our lives and our brains is just kind of passed over.
Right.
And that's, I think, really interesting.
Right. And it's inevitable, right? Complexity is coming to us. There are troubles. There are going to be stressful situations ahead that are going to be difficult to handle. And if we don't have the right vocabulary, and I think part of this gets back to sense foraging, if we're missing out on the body vocabulary of how to deal with things, we might end up in a situation where we're not optimizing our decisions, and clearly not optimizing our life.
Right. And it kind of takes me, and this is a leap, but because the world is so complex and novel in many ways, right? Going to Danny Kahneman, late great Danny Kahneman, and the intuitive heuristic, where when we're faced with a difficult question, we answer an easier one instead, and oftentimes without noticing that substitution. I think we can we don't take in the complexities and we substitute the easier habit.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So
we're missing out on really optimizing our decision for that situation, because we're really not dealing with that situation.
No.
Right? The Kahneman's intuitive heuristic kind of says we're not actually dealing with that one. We're dealing.
Right.
We've sort of minimized it to make the question easier to answer, and because of that, we're not really dealing with the heart of what that question, of what the core question is, and I think that causes us to miss out. I think that there's something less desirable about that.
And I think that goes back into the autopilot that we are on, as opposed to making sure that our habits are building us up, right? As opposed to just letting us coast.
Yeah. I also think that when Norm and Zinn talk about like trying harder or toughing it out, they are not the solutions to every problem.
No.
It's not just about pull yourself up by your bootstraps, because that is actually not the best way of dealing with things, because it just leads to burnout. It gets back to those core questions, those core issues we talked about at the beginning.
Right. We need to break that routine, right? And so what was it that they said? The calcification of your emotional responses.
Yeah.
Just again, that's fantastic quote. That's a quote, right? And we don't want to calcify our emotional responses.
Right.
We want them to be real and there and not hardened, right? So
yeah, I would agree.
All right. So let's I think there's some other really interesting pieces that we can focus in on here. I don't want to make sure, we probably should have said this up front, right? Yeah, the terms of like DMN, or default mode network. That's our habits, right? So when it's talked about the default mode network, really it's like that's how we get into these habits, various different things.
The neurology of it. Yeah. Absolutely. They also mentioned the salience network, which alerts us to what needs to be attended to in the moment. And the salience network is, again, another neurological thing, but you can be intentional in what you want to do and what you want to focus on. You don't always just have to just be attracted by the bright, shiny object.
Right.
And we do have some agency.
Yeah. And then NIH is the National Institute of Health, which is a funding and research governing bodies about developing across developed countries in our world. So
yeah, I think it's good. Thank you, Kurt, for bringing those out, because I think we just need to let those know. But what can we do? I guess that's the question: is what do these guys think that, and what do you and I think that we can do to make our life better, to get more in our groove, to use sense foraging as a way to improve our lives?
Be aware, right? So we talk about knowing is not even half the battle all the time. This G.I. Joe fallacy. But knowing in this instance, I think can help. It is maybe not half the battle, but by being intentional, right? This idea of purposefully paying attention to our senses, to think about what is that feeling that right now you're feeling with your fingertips? What is the sense that you have for your feet? Think everybody that's listening, like what's we don't think about our feet, right? Are you feeling the socks on your feet? Are you wearing shoes? Are you standing up? Are you feeling the pressure on them? Are you sitting in a chair and maybe they're up in there? Are you wearing sandals? Are you on the beach? Are they feeling sand? What are you feeling with your feet? And being intentional about thinking about that throughout the day in various points. Again, the more that we can get into the habit of stopping and kind of savoring or thinking about and being intentional, being aware, I think it's helpful.
Curiosity is another part of that.
No, what are you talking about?
Just asking the question, just saying, what could now be like if I was paying attention, if I was just aware and connected to my fingers and what the world smells like, what the light is like in the room.
Yeah. Being intentional about that. So, all right, I'm going to shamelessly or unshamelessly plug Brain Shift Journal or Even we have a new journal that'll come out called the Daily Shift Journal. It's coming out sometime this summer, end of summer kind of time frame. It's a little less rigorous than the Brain Shift Journal, but still super rich journaling experience. But by doing that journaling exercise, and we have prompts in there every day that like, how do I need to show up?
Yeah.
Right? What is the way that I want to show up in the world? And by being intentional about how I want to show up, you're more likely to have to show up in that way. And there's pieces about gratitude. There's pieces about noticing the things that are going on in your life. And so by being and using that journal, you can tap into some of this sense forging. So
I'd also, I think that's great. You should shamelessly or unshamelessly. Is it possible to unshamelessly do something?
How does that? I don't know.
Or shamefully.
Shamefully or shamelessly. Anyway, shamelessly. That's what I'm doing. I'm plugging.
Groovers, Brain Shift is great. And when Daily Shift comes out, you got to check it out. That's the
There you
short
go.
story.
Cool.
There's also just the savoring factor. I'm really glad that you brought that up earlier, because we've got to get out and do something different. That life can be so much richer. We can create our own groove moments just by savoring what is going on around us. So using our senses to discovering those things is a really key way of enhancing our life experience.
And I like this concept of groove moments. It's cool, right? We let's find more groove moments in our day. And to do that, we can make it a practice, right?
Yeah.
There's this idea that, all right, we've talked about the house of habit and how it can be negative in some ways, but if we go on autopilot, but you can actually turn that around and make it more ritualistic in its component, where you embed those habits, that practice, with some sense of meaning that you then savor those moments, and you focus in on paying attention and being aware and intentional and curious about your life.
You use the word practice, and that just makes me think about, if I'm going to learn a new song, it's 3.5 or 4 minutes long, let's say, I'm not going to necessarily have to tackle the whole song. If it's a difficult piece, I might break it down into parts and then practice it. Right? I'm going to practice each part. And so sense forging doesn't have to start with, I'm going to do all of it at the, everything all at the same time. You can just pick one and just practice it. You can just practice sunrises or sunsets or the breakfast or feeling your toes or just one of those things.
Or even, I think Zindel was talking about listening to songs, right? I know what this song sounds like, but you know what? That song, you can focus in on different aspects of that song. Or how is this song making me feel in the moment?
Yeah.
And you know what? Cream cheese is cream cheese, but cream cheese isn't always cream cheese. Cream cheese can be, think about cream cheese on that bagel, or cream cheese as a dip, as a dip, not a dick. There you go.
Just a dip. Yeah.
A dip.
Which kind of gets to that toggling thing that they talked about, right? Just try curiosity in one area, bring your curiosity and intentionality to that area and just work on improving that. Just toggle from where you used to be to where you could be.
Just a bit.
Just a
right?
bit. Yeah.
How about we wrap it up there?
That sounds good. I am so glad that we get to talk to such incredibly smart and warm people as Norm and Zin. They are cool. They are doing cool work. Just really grateful to have them as guests.
Yeah, I agree. And to help us keep these episodes going, please give us a quick review or 5-star rating on your Apple or Spotify
anything,
or whatever it is. It goes a long way, a very, very long way, in helping other people find behavioral grooves and the wonderful sensory indulgence that behavioral grooves is. And it costs you nothing to pay it forward, just a bit. And you would earn our gratitude and our appreciation.
Absolutely.
If you did such. Yeah.
And with that, we hope that you are able to take some of these cool concepts, such as sense forging or managing your house of habit, and you use them this week to help you go out and find your groove.